Roman dodecahedrons are puzzling artifacts from antiquity. They're never shown in Roman art. They're never mentioned in Roman texts. Over the years, dozens of theories about their function have been proposed, but their purpose remains unknown. Can we reason our way through the fog of mystery surrounding these curious items? Let's find out. We'll cover the history of these objects. We'll discuss a number of theories about their function. Then we'll suggest our own ideas. First, a few general comments. As always, we colorize and enhance old photos. To avoid repeating dodecahedrons, we'll shorten them to just dods. Finally, if you're here because you want to hear a mind-blowing solution, you'll be let down. On this channel, we avoid ideas that sound clever, but which, in our judgment, can't overcome their counter-arguments. We lean towards ideas which may be mundane, but in our judgment, have the fewest counter-arguments. Having said that, if you want to see more videos, please like and subscribe. Roman dodecahedrons, or dods, are mysterious artifacts from the Roman Empire. They date back to between the 2nd and 4th centuries. The first one was discovered in 1739 in Aston, UK. Sadly, it's now lost. Over 130 dods have been found by now, primarily in what was the Roman Gaul. They're made of bronze, with 12 pentagonal faces and a hollow center. Their sizes range from 4 to 11 centimeters. The two most prominent features are the circular holes of varied sizes in the center of each face, and protruding pegs in each corner. No two dods are identical, and the hole sizes are different across the dods. They show little signs of use and bear no inscriptions. Let's now explore the cultural, geographical, and historical context surrounding the dods. Not many people know that the dods had kind of precursor objects, at least design-wise, particularly in the Gallic and Celtic areas. These objects are somewhat similar, like small cages with knobs, though without the flat faces with round holes. They're thought to be amulet containers for a gem or some other memento. One of them was found in Pompeii, in a store that sold jewelry and possibly magic items. Such an ornamental cage design still exists today. Knob-like protrusions are seen on pre-Roman Gallic and Celtic metal objects, which may have functioned as proto-money. Cage amulets and knobs may have influenced the design of the dods, but not necessarily their function. Another possible influence on the dods may have been dice. There were 6-sided dice in antiquity, similar to modern ones. There were also 20-sided ones and others. Of note in this image are the Greek knucklebone dice, a die with animals, and a Ptolemaic Egyptian die with names of gods. The top face shows the name of the scarab god Khepri. Relevant to the dods, there were also 12-sided dice. This one, with zodiac signs, is often listed as a Roman dodecahedron, but it's not. It's a small solid die with no knobs. 12-sided dice were often used for fortune-telling, for example employed by Greek oracles. Oracles were a significant source of income for the temples. One way to tell fortune was to roll a die, look up an equivalent verse in some text, then interpret it. There were special books just for this purpose, like the Sortes Sangallenses. The verses are rather vague, such as, "This year big turmoil among the population," which may apply to many years. In Europe, divination with 12-sided die survived into the 17th century. A possible, though indirect influence on the dods may have come from Greek philosophy. Pythagoras and Theaetetus investigated the geometric shapes now called the Platonic solids. Plato linked the first 4 to the 4 elements. The last one, the dodecahedron, he captured in an enigmatic quote, usually taken to mean the zodiac or the cosmos. These mystical ideas survived long past antiquity. The astronomer Kepler was enthralled by Platonic solids, including the dodecahedron, and he built an esoteric cosmology based on them. To finish this section, we should note that dods, in turn, may have spread their own influence. Dod-like jewelry pieces have been found in Southeast Asia, in Burma, Thailand, Vietnam, and China. Roman Empire traded as far as these locations, so these shapes may have been influenced by the Romans. Whatever the Roman influence, in Asia these objects appear to be just jewelry. Some are as small as 1 centimeter, which seems to preclude any other use. Let's now share miscellaneous details. Maybe one of them will spark an insight. The composition and a radiograph of one of the dods don't reveal anything unusual. Most of the dods were cast in bronze, likely with the lost wax process. The corner knobs were cast along with the body, but some were soldered on or repaired. All the knobs are narrower at the base. The dods generally show very little signs of wear, except in some cases, natural corrosion. They've been found in all sorts of contexts. It suggests use by the population in general, rather than some specialized group. One object departs from others in that it's an icosahedron. It doesn't have the center holes on every face. Rather, it has tiny holes in what looks like decorative arrangement. On the dods, all faces seem equivalent at first, but there's often one differentiated axis. One pair of opposite holes differs from others. They're either oblong, with no rings, or much bigger. The icosahedron also has 2 large holes on 2 opposite faces. This is likely the result of some practical steps taken during casting. The faces on top and bottom were set up differently to improve the flow, ease core removal, etc. In other words, the shape of 2 holes was decided by the fabrication process. One dod, found in Feldberg, Germany, had what looked like some yellow wax on the inside. In the tomb of a wealthy woman in Krefeld, Germany, an elongated bone object was found next to a dod. Unfortunately, the bone object was so deteriorated that it's now lost. Some speculate if the bone was maybe a kind of a handle, but the dimensions don't quite match. The bone object seems a bit too thick for the largest holes, and, if fully inserted, there would be just a few centimeters left outside the dod, not quite enough for a secure grip. One partial dod has 3 smaller knobs at each corner instead of just 1. It means that whatever the function of a single knob, it can be performed by a triplet of smaller ones. One dod has a notch in one of its holes. This doesn't look intentional, as the ornamental rings go right through this notch. It's more likely an attempt to remove and fix a crack. Looks like this repair wasn't finished, or it failed again. Regardless, it suggests whatever the function of the holes, they remain functional even with a small notch. Finally, one dod is made of iron. As far as hole sizes, there have been many statistical analyses done on them, but none led to any insight. We'll add an analysis of our own. We'd like to thank Mr. Michael Guggenberger for providing size data from his upcoming book. He's one of the foremost researchers of this subject. His book may be available on Amazon around the time this video is released. Returning to the analysis, here's our histogram of all hole sizes in millimeters. The comb-like spikes are most likely an artifact of manual measuring in the past. The hole sizes have been collected from descriptions going back to early 19th century. Often sizes were reported rounded off to the nearest millimeter. Most likely we see spikes for even millimeter values, though actual hole sizes differ slightly. We can get rid of the spikes by increasing the bin size. In general, the distribution looks log normal. In other words, the sizes seem random within the feasible manufacturing range. This argues against theories of the dods being some measuring devices. But what if we make hole sizes relative to the size of their respective dod? Maybe it was the hole size relative to the object size that mattered. But again, the distribution looks log normal. What about ratios of opposite hole pairs, bigger to smaller? The ratios range from 1 to about 2 and seem to fit a power law distribution. In other words, these ratios don't seem to target any specific numbers. To sum up this section, statistical analyses don't really give us any useful insights. There have been dozens of theories about the purpose of the dods. In this section, we'll tackle the most popular ones. As a visual aid in this discussion, we'll use a table of counter-arguments that are common among several theories. Since we're dealing with Rome, we'll give it a fancy Latin name, tabula argumentorum. At the top is a list of major theories. On the left are the common counter-arguments. Let's start with a popular theory, a device for knitting gloves. Other people have already pointed out several problems with this idea. Humans have an opposable thumb attached at the base of the palm. When knitting a finger glove, the finger, palm, and thumb are separate problems. An object like the dods does nothing to help you with the palm piece or properly attaching the thumb. Another key issue, the stitch count on each finger is determined only by the number of pegs. The hole sizes don't matter, so why even make them different? By the way, human fingers don't differ nearly as much in size as the holes. With a dod, you always get only 5 stitches around a finger. When stretched on an actual hand, this creates gaps, defeating the purpose of a glove. We looked at actual knitted gloves. On properly handmade ones, we count at least 16 stitches around a finger, or 3 times more. Commercially made gloves have 20 stitches, or 4 times more. A far simpler knitting device would do the trick. For the fingers and the thumb, you just need a ring or a tube with 16 pegs or more. If you insist on one for each finger, you could have a device like this. Supporters of this theory say that we don't find dods in Italy itself, because gloves were only needed in colder climates in the north. Ironically, the only 2 mentions of gloves from Roman times come to us from Italy itself, not from the north. Since gloves were needed in Italy too, we should find dods there too, if dods had been used for knitting gloves. By the way, the earliest verifiably knitted object is from around 1000 AD. Before that time, gloves had been made by sewing together pieces of fabric. Here's how the knitting theory fares with some common counter-arguments. Why not make this device out of wood? The heaviest dod weighs about 1 kilo or 2 pounds. Can you easily manipulate something this heavy for a prolonged time? If it's used for manufacturing, why do we find only individual ones, and never several ones in a workshop? Since Romans in Italy used gloves, why don't we find them in Italy? Finally, why not have more knobs for more stitches and better gloves? Let's move on to the next, somewhat related theory. The dods were used to make tube-like chains out of wire, mostly for jewelry. The chains were pulled through smaller and smaller holes to make them narrower. As evidence, we're shown 2 Roman necklaces on a woven gold wire chain. Firstly, just to clarify, the woven gold wire was one of many styles of Roman necklaces. It wasn't a standard component. Secondly, and more importantly, on all Roman necklaces we found, with one exception, the woven gold chain has 4, not 5 stitches. If the dods, all with 5 pegs, had been used for gold wire weaving, it's very odd that nearly all woven gold wire chains have 4 stitches. The one exception has 5 visible stitches, but it's not clear if it's a strip or a flattened tube with 10 stitches in total. Some of such woven chains look very delicate. It's questionable if one could tighten them up by pulling through a metal hole without tearing. This theory is shown working with a metal wire maybe 1 millimeter thick. What works with a 1 millimeter metal wire doesn't necessarily work with a much thinner one. Also, working with metal wire would likely leave many linear scuff marks. Yet most dods, unless corroded, show almost no signs of wear. Here's our evaluation of this theory in the common counter-arguments table. Another recently popular theory is that this device was used for encrypting and decrypting messages. This was done with alphabet keys on wooden discs, mounted on differently sized wooden axes, which fit into the holes. The most obvious objection here is that all dods have differently sized holes. But this theory needs pairs of dods with identical hole sizes to work. Some dods have holes with identical sizes, which doesn't make sense in this theory. Some dods were buried in graves, which is strange, as it makes this device available for study to third parties. It's a bit like Germans in World War II burying a fallen soldier with an Enigma machine. In cases of deliberately hidden dods, like in tombs or coin hoards, we should also find the cipher discs, as without them, the dod is useless. But we don't find such discs. It would be far simpler to make a flat piece with 5 pegs and a protruding flat cone in the center with several steps. The functionality is the same, but it's much more portable and more easily hidden. Here's how we think this theory scores with common objections. The next theory is that the dods were weapons, most likely mace heads. It's an unlikely theory. To start with, maces weren't common in ancient Rome, in contrast to the Middle Ages. The hollow center, thin walls, and knobs with thin stems are all poor choices for a mace head. Mace heads have robust, hollow tubes in their base to properly secure them on wooden handles. A hole in a thin wall is insufficient for this purpose. As far as common counter-arguments, a mace head could hardly work with a 7mm thin handle. Also, it's very unlikely that in ancient Rome, a woman would be buried with a mace head, a very muscle-oriented weapon. A somewhat related theory is that dods were scepter heads. This is the first theory without major objections. One objection that still applies is that scepter heads typically have distinct tubular mounts for the staff. The dods don't have them. An interesting fact is that some scepters had a small ball within and functioned as rattles. A related item is a pilgrim's rattle, a handheld metal cage with small objects inside. But the dods seem ill-suited to be a rattle, with differently sized holes, some of them large. Scepters are strongly linked to culture, which could explain the dods being found only in certain areas. Scepters are ornamental, not functional, so most functional objections don't really apply. The next theory is that dods are proof-of-skill objects, required to be made by applicants to join a metalworking workshop. Historically, masterpieces were required by medieval guilds, so one could rise to the next rank. But every guild had its own rules, and the objects were practical, that is, what the guild produced. It seems odd that the same, specific, abstract, uncommon shape would be required by all workshops in such a big area of the Roman Empire. Workshops probably had many applicants over time, so if the demo objects were so unusually standardized everywhere, it's not clear why we don't find a few such objects in one place. Also, some standardized metalworking demo object in a rich woman's grave seems unusual. The next theory is that of a rangefinder, or a way to optically estimate distance to a person or an object far away. Firstly, let's clarify. This theory sounds more capable than how it actually works. You don't get to quickly establish an arbitrary distance. Instead, what you really get are 6 predetermined distances, decided by your dod's hole sizes. You can quickly tell the distance to a known size object only if it's at one of these 6 fixed distances. If it's not, you need to do some math. Let's now list the objections to this theory. The biggest one. The dods have no markings or instructions. Very impractical, given this proposed function. Compare it to the Antiquity device, which had labels on the dials, and even a mini user guide on the back. The knobs don't serve any purpose in this theory, so why add them to every dod? Some dods have opposite holes of equal sizes, which makes no sense in this context. With some hole pairs, the arm holding the device would need to be 1 or 2 meters long, which is hard to achieve for a normal human.
So the murderer must be somebody in this room, unless he had very long arms. Say 30 or 40 feet.
In such a case, you could put the dod on some stand that far away from you, but then your eyes won't be able to align the holes properly from that far away. There are far simpler devices called stadia used before rifle scopes. They can tell you an arbitrary distance, within a broad range, to an object with a known size, like a person. You just need to keep the device at a fixed distance from your eye, usually with a string. Several Roman writers, such as Vitruvius, Vegetius, Proclus, and Frontinus, described how Romans actually did surveying. The dods are never mentioned by any of them. For basic surveying, Romans used devices called groma, dioptra, libra, and chorobates. To measure distances, Romans used 3 methods. Special 10-foot poles called decimpedes. And no, this is not where the touch with a 10-foot pole phrase comes from. It appeared in English only in the 18th century. The second method was a rope with markers. The third method, the most impressive one, was a Greek-inspired machine called hodometer, similar to a modern measuring wheel. As the hodometer was rolled on the ground, it counted the distance traveled using small pebbles. Here's the rangefinder idea versus common counter-arguments. Seems somewhat peculiar for a rich woman to have a range-finding device in her tomb. There's a whole class of theories about measuring some round objects, coins, pipes, weapon shafts, etc. The most obvious objection are the completely non-standardized holes across the dods. You'd also expect some markings regarding what each hole is supposed to measure. A flat device with holes would be far more portable, the same way modern gauges are almost always flat. The Roman coins weren't perfectly round. They had uneven edges, ill-suited to be measured by a fixed circle. As far as measuring pipes, Frontinus in his book on aqueducts goes on for several pages about nothing but pipe dimensions and pipe types, yet dods are never mentioned. Here's our evaluation of the measuring device theories. Next theory, a device farmers use to find the sun's angle at noon so they know when to start sowing. This is possibly the least useful theory of all. There's a simple thing that does exactly what this theory calls for. It's called a calendar. Every year the sun reaches the same angle at noon on the same calendar day, so why measure it? Even illiterate farmers still went to the nearest town on market days and could ask what day it was. Also, sowing is not as simple as the calendar date. There are weather factors independent of calendar days, longer winters or summers, drought, etc. Signs like animal behavior, the condition of trees or river levels, generally signal how far in the yearly cycle the nature is. Farmers had been tuned into such signs for centuries. They hardly needed a calendar, much less a sun angle device. To actually measure the sun angle, Romans had either big sundials in public places or smaller portable ones. Here's our verdict on the sun angle idea. The next concept is that of a versatile candle holder, able to accommodate variously sized candles. It doesn't seem like such a device was necessary. If a candle is too thick, just warm up the bottom of the candle or trim some wax off. There are even devices just to do this. If a candle's too thin, you can just drip some wax into the holder and set the candle in it. Actual ancient candle holders typically have a wide base for stability and a tray or a shield disc to collect the wax. If the dods were candle holders, the wax would drip all over them. Also, holes of the same size don't quite make sense in this theory. Here's how we judge this theory. As far as the dods being gaming dice, the objections are obvious. The differently sized holes make the dice unfair. A gaming die weighing 1 kilo or 2 pounds seems like an overkill, and the knobs prevent free rolling. For the last 4 categories, a toy for kids, a game for adults, divination, or an ornament, we can't really pose any objections, because we can't address requirements that are unknown to us today. The only objections we can make are, a metal toy for kids weighing 1 kilo or 2 pounds seems a bit too heavy. You may ask, would objects like this be buried in a tomb? The answer is yes. The Frankish ruler, Childeric I, was buried with his favorite crystal ball and other strange things like 300 golden bees and a golden bull's head. A young Roman man in Patras, Greece, who was possibly involved in divination, was buried with his dodecahedral die. There's a pattern that emerges in the arguments table we've created. Theories about very pragmatic uses have significant objections. Theories linked to culture, religion, symbolism, divination, entertainment, or ornaments have few or none. Logic suggests we should focus the search for a solution in areas with the fewest objections. There are 3 more arguments in favor of these categories. 1. The ornaments on the dods resemble the ring ornaments and small concentric circles on Roman dice and tokens. This suggests links to culture rather than strictly pragmatic use. 2. We can't know for sure if the similar jewelry in Southeast Asia was in fact influenced by the Roman dods. But if it had been, it would be more likely to have borrowed from cultural items, not pragmatic ones. It's more likely for divination or game items to influence jewelry rather than, say, a military rangefinder. 3. The dods bear the hallmarks of a cultural fad. They're limited to one cultural area and a relatively short period of time, about 2 centuries. This resembles other cultural fads, for example seances, that were all the rage in the 19th century. The problem with these categories is that they follow tastes, preferences, or rules unknown to us today. We can't logically deduce them. We can only guess. We'll now offer our guesses in these 3 categories. These are just speculations. There's no way to prove any of them. As far as divination, key concepts may be as follows. It's not the absolute hole sizes that matter, but the relative sizes. And the fortune teller may assign meaning to the sizes of the holes differently for each session, the same way ranks, meanings, or even exclusion of playing cards are not fixed, but are set depending on the game. For fortune-telling purposes, the relative hole sizes could be metaphors for time or space. For example, in the time metaphor, if we perform some divination procedure in the direction from a smaller hole to a bigger hole, it means we're looking into the future. If both holes are equal, we're looking into the present. The direction from a bigger hole to a smaller hole denotes the past. In the space metaphor, the relative hole sizes stand for distances, respectively, far away, close by or here, and the inner space. Inner space could mean something like a look into the person we're telling the fortune for, physically or psychologically. The scale of the relative differences in hole sizes could also matter. The bigger the differences, the bigger the distance in space or time. The procedure itself can be any of the countless fortune-telling methods, often based on some random pattern or behavior. Since wax was found in one of the dods, we'll test pouring of hot wax into water, where the shape of the cooled wax, or its shadow, is used for divination. In the relevant holes, we added a web made of a thread to give more turbulence to the wax. It works fine. We certainly got intricate shapes, ready for interpretation. This method is rather messy. It seems that more wax would have been found on the dods. On the other hand, waxes do break down over time, so who knows? Maybe other dods were used with other methods, like sand, seeds, blowing smoke through the holes, etc. Here's our idea for a game using the dods. It's called Capture the Coin. The goal is to cover a coin, precariously balanced on a small object, with the closest matching hole, by manipulating the dod with a string. You can't touch the dod directly, and the coin must not be disturbed. This dod is made of plastic so it jitters. A metal dod would have more inertia and be more controllable. You may win the coin if you succeed, so it could be a gambling game. There may be many different rules, such as the ones listed here. Roman coins not being perfectly round actually adds to the game, as it introduces an element of chance. You have to correctly estimate the smallest matching hole for the specific coin. The game can also be played with other valuables, like small gems, etc. With the dod spinning and a candle inside, we get projected circles. This may have been a way to create a mystical mood by simulating moving planets. We tried projecting textures, like dried leaves, but this doesn't work. The flame is too big and too close to the dod's walls for images to be sharp, so the projected result is just a blurry circle. Though this idea does work with modern, strong, pinpoint light sources and larger dods. You may have noticed that we've not discussed the icosahedron. We consider it a closely related item, but not the same as the classic Roman dods. It may have been used in similar surroundings, but not necessarily in the same way. For example, it may have been used to project stars on the wall in a fortune-telling parlor for ornamental reasons, while the dods performed a different function. As an aside, the icosahedron can work as a noisemaker if you attach short straps with small balls to the knobs and twist the object around. The dods wouldn't work as well due to their holes, unless you fit something in the holes. To end this video, let's tie up a few loose ends. The question still remains, why don't we find references to the dods in Roman art or literature? One possible answer is their link to superstition or gambling. Many ordinary Romans were superstitious, but the official attitude was ambivalent. It distinguished between Roman religion and superstitions, beliefs of usually foreign origin. There were Roman laws against engaging in magic. Some cults like Mithra or Jupiter Dolicanus were tolerated or even supported. Some were banned, like the Bacchanalia in 186 BC. On several occasions, magicians were expelled and their books burned. Romans may have preferred to keep quiet about consulting a fortune teller. Another often made suggestion is that the dods have some military purpose, since their finds have a higher concentration near the Roman frontier. But correlation is not causation. Divination may have been more frequent near the frontier because people there lived in a more risky environment. People in such circumstances are more anxious about the future. Combined with older Gallic or Celtic traditions, this may have led to a higher fortune-telling activity. The suggestions presented here may not be what the dods were used for, but they can still serve as a springboard for other ideas.